I believed in his innocence. I defended him when no one else would. I stood in front of judges, lawyers, strangers, and even my own family, speaking on his behalf with unwavering certainty. I told everyone he was a good man. I told them he was kind, honest, and misunderstood. I swore that he could never do the things they said he did. I thought my loyalty meant something. I thought it would be enough. But I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong. And the truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. When I first met Daniel, he was the kind of man who made you feel like the world had stopped spinning just to let you catch your breath. He had this calm confidence about him, the kind that settled into a room before he even spoke. We met at a charity fundraiser. I was there helping with logistics, and he was a guest donor. Tall, composed, with dark eyes that seemed to read everything you were not saying. He asked me about my work instead of talking about himself. He listened, really listened. And when he smiled, it was like warmth had a shape. Our first date was not extravagant, but it was unforgettable. A small corner cafe, low lights, soft jazz playing through old speakers, and the way he watched me like nothing else mattered. I remember thinking, this is the kind of man people write stories about. Steady, kind, respectful. Within months, I was spending more time at his apartment than my own. He made me feel safe, and in a world full of noise and pressure, safety felt like love. 2 years passed. We moved in together. I met his family. He met mine. Everyone loved him. My mother called him the one. My best friend, Maya, said he reminded her of the kind of man most women search their whole lives for. I never saw anything that made me question that. But life has a cruel way of shifting under your feet just when you start to believe in the ground beneath you. It was a cold Thursday morning when everything fell apart. I was in the kitchen, halfway through making breakfast when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, expecting a delivery or maybe a neighbor. Instead, it was 2 men in dark suits and badges. They asked for Daniel. When I called out to him, he came out of the bedroom, confused, still pulling on a shirt. The officers did not waste any time. They said he was being arrested for multiple charges: fraud, obstruction of justice, and something else that made my knees give out. Accessory to assault. I remember screaming. I remember trying to pull one of the officers back, asking what this was, telling them there had to be a mistake. Daniel said nothing. He looked at me, but he said nothing. That silence cut deeper than anything else. I followed them all the way to the station. I sat outside the interrogation room for hours. When they let me see him, I grabbed his hands and begged him to explain. He told me everything was going to be fine, that it was a misunderstanding, that someone was setting him up. I believed him. Of course I believed him, because I had given him everything. My time, my trust, my heart, and I was not ready to believe that the man I loved, the man I built a life with, was capable of doing what they said he did. That was the day everything changed. And yet, in that moment, I made the decision that would define the next year of my life. I chose to stand by him. The days following Daniel's arrest passed in a blur of confusion and dread. I barely slept, barely ate, and could hardly think straight. My mind was caught in an endless loop, replaying the moment the officers led him out of our apartment in handcuffs. I kept telling myself that it was all just a terrible mistake. Daniel was not capable of doing something cruel. He was the man who remembered my favorite tea, the man who rubbed my shoulders when I worked too late, the man who held me when I cried after losing my father. He was not a criminal. He could not be. But when the full list of charges came out, my stomach turned inside out. Wire fraud, falsification of records, conspiracy to commit assault. Those were the words printed in black ink on white paper. Cold, factual, terrifying. According to the prosecutors, Daniel had been involved in an investment scheme that defrauded dozens of people out of their life savings. He was accused of being part of a small but well-connected group that manipulated accounts, forged identities, and moved large sums of money through shell corporations. That alone was overwhelming. But what made it unbearable was the assault charge. They claimed Daniel had arranged for someone to be intimidated, physically. A former client who had tried to expose the operation. That client had ended up in the hospital. I remember sitting across from Daniel in the jail's visitation room, my hands trembling as I held the sheet listing the charges. This is not you, I whispered. He looked at me, calm, almost too calm. It is not what it looks like, he said. I did not hurt anyone. I never told anyone to hurt anybody. I was trying to help clean up someone else's mess, and now they are dragging me down with them. His voice was steady. His eyes were clear. And for a moment I wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. He said that the fraud charges were overblown, that he had worked with a few investment firms but never had access to the financial decisions. He said the assault accusation was absurd, that he had nothing to do with what happened to that man. He even told me that someone must have forged his name on some documents, that they were using him as a scapegoat. I listened, nodded, wiped tears from my cheeks, and promised him I would not give up. But the truth had already started whispering in my ears. It began with small memories, things I had buried without meaning to. Like the time I found a burner phone in the drawer next to his bed. He told me it was for work, something about needing a separate line for high-value clients. I had accepted that explanation without question. Or the time he came home late with blood on his shirt and said it was from helping a stranger who had fallen on the street. I had believed that too. Why would I not? Now those moments replayed in my head with a different tone. The burner phone, the excuses, the times he got defensive when I asked simple questions, the calls he would take in another room, the way his stories never quite lined up when I pressed him for details. My friends noticed the change in me first. Maya came over a few days after the charges were made public. She brought coffee and sat across from me, holding my hand. I know you love him, she said gently. But this is not some parking ticket. These are serious charges. What if he is not the man you think he is? I pulled my hand back. You do not know him like I do. She looked at me, eyes filled with sorrow. Maybe you do not either. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to defend him. But deep down I was already starting to question everything. Got worse. My sister stopped calling. My coworkers began avoiding me in the office kitchen. Someone sent an anonymous message to my work email, calling me the girlfriend of a criminal. People who once hugged me now gave me small, polite nods from a distance. I was alone in a way I had never been before. And yet I still showed up to court. I sat behind Daniel every single day, listening to the prosecution lay out their case with chilling precision. They showed bank transfers, email threads, private messages from encrypted apps. They showed photos of Daniel with people I had never seen before, shady men in low-lit bars, businessmen with no names attached. The defense, on the other hand, painted Daniel as a loyal employee who had been caught in a storm not of his own making. They said he was being targeted because he refused to stay quiet. They said he was brave. I wanted to believe that, clung to it. But then came the testimony from the man who had been attacked. He was in his 50s, dressed in a plain grey suit, walking with a cane. His voice was low, calm, measured. He said he had been a whistleblower, that he tried to pull out of the operation when he realized where the money was coming from, that he had received threats, that one day, 2 men came to his home and beat him so badly he spent 3 weeks in the hospital. He said one of the men told him, "This is from D. You should have stayed quiet." D. Daniel. I looked over at Daniel. He did not flinch. His face was still. After the man left the stand, I went to the bathroom and vomited. I told myself the man could have lied, that he was trying to protect himself, that maybe he was the real criminal. But it was getting harder to hold on to those thoughts. Every night I lay in bed, surrounded by silence. I remembered things I had once ignored. Daniel's temper, sharp and sudden when things did not go his way. The time he grabbed my wrist too hard and apologized only when he saw the red mark. The way he talked about people he disliked. So cold, so detached. At the time I thought he was just intense. Now I was not so sure. The Daniel I had loved seemed to be slipping through my fingers, like sand I could not hold on to no matter how tightly I tried. One evening, as I sat in our apartment alone, I looked through the drawer where he kept his old files. I needed something, anything, to prove he was still the man I believed he was. But what I found only made things worse. There was a folder filled with client records. Some of the names matched the ones mentioned in court. There were handwritten notes, coded names, numbers, symbols I did not understand. And there was a photo of Daniel, smiling next to a man who had been identified as the leader of the operation. He had lied to me. He had lied so well for so long that I had built my entire world around a fiction. I sat there for hours, staring at the evidence of the man I never really knew. And still, part of me hoped there was more to the story. That something would come to light to explain it all away. That I would wake up and realize this was just a nightmare. But no matter how hard I tried to close my eyes, the truth was already wide awake. And it was watching everything unravel. Every morning during the trial, I woke before the sun. I moved like a ghost through our apartment, now half empty and silent, gathering what I needed before making my way to the courthouse. I had stopped wearing color. Every day it was the same black dress, the same flat shoes, the same thin coat draped over my shoulders. I wanted to appear composed. I wanted to look strong. But beneath that careful exterior, I was unraveling one slow thread at a time. Court began at 9, but I always arrived an hour early. I would sit on the cold bench outside the courtroom, clutching my coffee, watching the other faces arrive. Lawyers with their briefcases, journalists with their notepads, strangers who had come for drama or scandal or justice, depending on who you asked. I never spoke to any of them. I kept my eyes on the floor or the wall or the courtroom door, waiting to be let in. Daniel was brought in through a different entrance. Each time he entered, my breath caught in my throat. He always looked neat, polished, calm. His hair was trimmed. His suits were tailored. He smiled at me as if we were meeting for dinner rather than watching his freedom hang by a thread. That smile, so familiar, so rehearsed, made my heart ache. He never looked afraid. That was the part that unnerved me the most. In private he was composed too. He would hold my hands across the glass in the visiting room and tell me everything would work out, that the truth always rises to the top, that his lawyers were good and the case was weak. He said the prosecution was grasping at straws, that they needed a name to pin it all on, and he had been convenient. He said, "They want a villain and I am wearing the wrong tie." It almost sounded like a joke. His legal team leaned hard into that narrative. They portrayed him as a successful but naive advisor, someone who had trusted the wrong people and gotten caught in the fallout. They said he had no direct access to the shell companies, that his name appeared on those documents because someone had copied his credentials, that he had been framed by a former partner with a grudge. They suggested that the witness who claimed Daniel was behind the assault had misheard the threat, or worse, had invented it to avoid his own prison time. For the first few days of the trial, I clung to those words. I sat on the bench behind the defense table, nodding when his lawyer spoke, giving him encouraging looks every time he turned around. I wanted the jury to see that I believed in him, that someone still did. When the reporters started circling me outside the courthouse, I gave a short statement. I said that Daniel was a good man, that the allegations were baseless, that I knew him better than anyone, and that this trial would prove his innocence. I wanted that to be true more than anything I had ever wanted in my life. But truth has a way of peeling back layers you never expected to lose. The prosecution did not waste time. They came prepared, sharp, and relentless. They laid out a timeline of the fraud, showing how the stolen funds were funneled through a web of businesses over 3 years. They presented documents that had Daniel's signature. They displayed bank transfers and wire records, all connected to names Daniel had once mentioned in passing. It was not just numbers and names. It was patterns. I listened to the lead prosecutor explain how Daniel had helped structure deals that looked clean on paper, but were designed to collapse after the victims invested. How he and a handful of others would pull their money out just before the fall. It was a classic pump and dump scheme, dressed in the language of safe investments and managed portfolios. Then came the emails. They were pulled from one of Daniel's work accounts, A private one, hidden from public view. Some of the emails were coded, written in phrases that made little sense until you realized what they implied. Others were more direct. References to pressure tactics, mentions of reminders for clients who were out of line. And one in particular that made the air leave my lungs. It read, "Handle him the way we talked about. No more games." The prosecutor read that line aloud in court, letting the silence afterward stretch like a wire pulled taut. I looked at Daniel. He was staring straight ahead, no reaction on his face. Not surprise, not fear, nothing. Later that day, I sat in our apartment clutching my phone. I scrolled back through old text messages from Daniel, looking for something, anything that would prove he had been framed. But instead I found a name. Contact I had never noticed before. The name was saved as Sam B. No last name. I opened the message thread. Most of the texts were deleted, but one remained. "Call me on the other line. Do not text here again." That was the moment I realized there had been another phone. Not the burner phone I found in the drawer months ago. Another one. Third device. I did not sleep that night. I sat in bed with the curtains drawn, the room heavy with silence, and stared at the ceiling. My mind was no longer racing. It was dragging its feet through thick mud, caught between memory and denial. I kept thinking about the time Daniel came home with scratches on his hand. He said he had helped someone fix their car, that they had slipped with a tool. I had smiled, kissed his knuckles, and thanked him for being kind. Now I wondered if that story had ever been true. A few days later, the defense asked me to testify. I had not expected that. I thought I would just be there to support him. But one of his lawyers pulled me aside and said that the jury needed to see the human side of Daniel, the loyal partner who knew him better than anyone else. They needed to see love. And I, apparently, was love. I took the stand with shaking hands. The courtroom looked different from that angle, taller, colder. I told the truth, the part of it I still believed. I said Daniel was kind, that he had always treated me with respect, that I never saw any signs of violence or criminal behavior, that I trusted him, and I meant it. At least I meant what I could mean. I had never seen him act violently. I had never heard him threaten anyone. But I also knew now that the surface did not tell the whole story. On cross-examination, the prosecutor asked me a question that made the room feel even colder. "Mississippi Lane, are you aware of any other phone numbers registered to Mr. Grant?" Froze. "No," I said softly. The prosecutor tilted his head. "Are you certain?" I found one phone once," I admitted. "He said it was for work. And you believed that?" I hesitated. "Yes, at the time." That pause lingered in the air long after I stepped down from the witness stand. After court that day, I went home and opened every drawer, every box, every forgotten corner of the apartment. I was not looking for proof of innocence anymore. I was looking for the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I found an envelope taped beneath the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were 2 SIM cards and a list of contact names with corresponding numbers. Half of the names matched the ones brought up in court. One name was circled in red. M. Wallace. I recognized it. He was one of the co-defendants who had taken a plea deal in exchange for his testimony. I sat on the floor for a long time, staring at that list. In court, Daniel continued to act the same. Confident, clean-cut, unshaken. He nodded at me each morning like we were in on some secret, like we were still united. But I was no longer sure who I was sitting behind. And slowly, quietly, the walls I had built around my love for him began to crack. Seeds of doubt, once small and easy to ignore, were now roots winding deep into everything I thought I knew. The man I had loved might not have been real. Or perhaps he was real, and this was just the part of him I had refused to see. The trial was far from over, but my faith in him was not just shaken. It was splintered. And each day in that courtroom, I was beginning to wonder if I had stood by the wrong man all along. The 4th week of the trial began like all the others, gray and slow and heavy. I had grown used to the rhythm of it. Early mornings, silent walks to the courthouse, the familiar security routine, the low hum of tension in the courtroom before the judge entered. I thought I had grown numb to the surprises, to the twists in the story that did not match the man I had known for 7 years. But nothing had prepared me for what happened that morning. The prosecution asked for a brief recess before calling their next witness. I sat upright, spine stiff, as the lead prosecutor stood and walked to the evidence screen. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. He cleared his throat and began with a statement that made my heart stutter. "We would like to introduce a new piece of digital evidence recovered from the defendant's personal storage drive, obtained through the most recent subpoena." Personal storage drive. That phrase alone was enough to make my fingers curl into fists in my lap. Daniel had told me everything was already on the table. He had insisted there was nothing more to come, no secrets. But now they were speaking of something new, something hidden. The screen flickered to life and displayed a folder labeled simply, Jan-September. Inside it were dozens of documents, financial spreadsheets, message logs, and video files. The prosecutor highlighted one particular folder titled, Client Meetings, Private. From that he played a short clip. The quality was grainy, but the audio was clear. Daniel's voice came through the speakers. Confident. Too confident. You make sure the guy understands what will happen if he does not pull out. We already warned him twice. Third time we escalate. My lungs forgot how to breathe. My body turned cold. I watched the jury's reaction, watched their eyes narrow, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. And then I looked at Daniel. He was expressionless. Not embarrassed. Not ashamed. Not surprised. It was as if he had already lived this moment in his mind and had chosen not to care. The prosecution paused the video and turned to the court. "We believe this recording demonstrates intent and knowledge, as well as a direct link to the threats made against a key witness." The judge allowed the evidence. I sat frozen on the courtroom bench, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear the rest of the proceedings. I had never seen that file. I had never known of that drive. I had asked Daniel point blank if there was anything he had hidden from me. He had looked me in the eye and said no. I had believed him. After court that day, I did not go straight home. I walked for nearly 2 hours, circling through side streets and parks, trying to calm the storm inside me. The memory of that voice, the casual menace in Daniel's words, echoed over and over. I remembered the day, nearly a year ago, when he had come home angry, pacing the living room. He had claimed a client had tried to defraud him. He said he had handled it, that everything had been cleaned up. He had made it sound like a business dispute. I had not asked questions. I had trusted him. That night, I sat alone in our apartment and opened my old laptop. I began searching through every old email account, cloud storage file, and shared folder I could think of. I combed through our digital life looking for something, anything that could explain what I had seen. I still wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was taken out of context. Perhaps that file was old or fake or twisted somehow. I still wanted to believe he had been honest with me. I began with our shared bank records. Most of them matched what I already knew. Rent, utilities, groceries, the occasional trip. But then I noticed a monthly payment I had never seen before. It was small, only a few $100s, but it had been going to the same company for 2 years. The name meant nothing to me. Westbrook Consulting. I searched it online. There was no official website, only a series of vague listings. Business directories with no phone number, no address. But I did find one small thread on a legal forum. Someone asking if anyone had heard of Westbrook Consulting, saying they had been contacted for a quiet resolution regarding a debt. My hands were shaking as I read. The next day, I returned to the courthouse, but I did not sit behind Daniel. I chose a different bench further back, where he could not easily catch my eye. I was no longer sure I wanted him to. The trial dragged on. Witnesses came and went. The defense grew more defensive. The prosecution grew bolder. And I began to do something I had never imagined I would do. I started investigating Daniel. In the evenings, I searched through everything I could access. Old messages, financial statements, work contacts. One name kept appearing. R. Mathers. I remembered him vaguely. Daniel had once referred to him as the cleaner. At the time I thought he was joking, maybe some kind of IT person. But now I was not so sure. I tracked down an old voicemail from that same number. The voice was rough, hard-edged. You said the payment was late. I handled it anyway. Next time send it faster. I do not like being the one who follows up. Felt sick. This was not about investments. This was not about misunderstood business transactions. There was a pattern forming, one of silence, intimidation, and control. I had been blind to it, shielded by Daniel's charm and the illusion of safety he had built around us. I remembered a night 2 years ago. We were supposed to meet friends for dinner. He was late, almost an hour. When he arrived, he looked disheveled, his knuckles red. He said he had gotten into a minor accident, something with a parking lot barrier. He laughed it off, kissed my forehead, and ordered a drink. Now I wondered if that redness had come from something else. From someone else. I continued digging. Eventually, I found an old folder on our home computer, buried deep inside another folder labeled tax docs. Inside it were screenshots, conversations with someone identified only as K. They discussed payments, meeting times, and something that made my blood run cold. A message that read, "Make sure she does not ask questions. She is loyal. Keep it that way." That message was dated 3 weeks before I testified. My chest felt hollow as I stared at the screen. I had been part of his plan. Pawn. Not his partner, not his equal, but a useful tool. My loyalty was something he had counted on, manipulated, and used. I thought of every time he had touched my face, whispered reassurances, thanked me for standing by him. Now I could not tell what had been real and what had been scripted. It became harder to sit through the trial. Harder to keep the mask on. I stopped speaking to the defense attorneys. I avoided Daniel's gaze. I felt the weight of my silence pressing against my ribs, begging to be broken. But I still needed more. I needed something definitive, something that could erase the last fragments of doubt clinging to my heart. That proof came one evening when I received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You need to see this." The message was short. No greeting, no signature, just a link to a file. I hesitated for several minutes before clicking it. When I did, a video loaded, grainy like the one shown in court but longer. The footage showed Daniel in a hotel room, sitting across from another man. The audio was clear. "You do not worry about her," Daniel said, his voice firm. "She would never believe anything bad about me. That is why she is perfect." The man laughed. "And if she ever does?" he asked. Daniel leaned forward. "Then we make sure she regrets asking." I stopped the video and sat in silence, the screen glowing in the darkness. My stomach twisted. My body felt cold. I had hoped for something to restore my faith in him. What I found instead was a confirmation that I had been living with a man capable of cruelty, deceit, and manipulation beyond what I had feared. I had stood by him, believed him, fought for him. And in return, he had seen me as a pawn to be moved, a piece of the narrative he needed to maintain his image. I had been nothing more than a prop in his story. The next morning I did not go to court. I sat at the kitchen table, the file still open on my laptop, and stared at the final remnants of my denial. Everything I had believed about Daniel was gone. The man I had loved was not who I thought he was. And now I had to decide what I would do with the truth. Because pretending any longer would mean betraying myself. The secrets were no longer hidden. They had crawled into the light, raw and undeniable. And so had the truth about him. The courtroom was hushed as the next witness took the stand. The energy in the room shifted. There was something about her presence, something sharp and unflinching. She was not nervous, not hesitant. She looked straight ahead, her voice steady as she stated her full name and profession. She was not a surprise witness, but I had not expected her to speak with such clarity, such familiarity. She introduced herself as a former associate of Daniel's, not just in business but in life. We were involved personally for 4 years, she said without hesitation. My breath caught in my throat. 4 years. I stared at her, this woman I had never seen, who now stood as a mirror reflecting a version of Daniel I had never known. The courtroom buzzed softly with murmurs, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The prosecutor guided her gently through her testimony. She spoke of late-night meetings, of whispered instructions, of secretive transfers of funds. But more than that, she spoke of manipulation, of charm turned cold, of promises made and broken. She spoke of how Daniel used words like tools, how he always seemed to know exactly what someone needed to hear. He made me feel like I was the only one who understood him, she said quietly. But then I found out there were others. Many others. Her eyes flicked to me just once and then away again. She did not need to say more. Understood. I sat frozen, my mind unraveling. 4 years. That meant he had been seeing her before me, possibly during our early months, possibly longer. My hands trembled in my lap. I had defended this man. I had stood in front of a court and sworn that he was honest, kind, misunderstood. And now, with every word this woman spoke, I felt my world fracture again. She described a pattern of coercion, how Daniel convinced people to act on his behalf, sometimes without realizing it, how he blurred the line between loyalty and fear, how he always found ways to stay clean, even when others got their hands dirty. The jury watched her intently, so did I. And when her voice faltered for just a second, when she mentioned the threats she had received after trying to cut ties with him, I felt a chill spread across my skin. I recognized her pain. It was not loud or theatrical. It was quiet, measured. The pain of someone who had survived something they did not yet have words for. When the testimony ended, the courtroom was silent. The prosecution sat down. The defense asked for a brief recess. I did not wait. I left the courtroom, stepping into the cold air, my mind spinning. I felt as if I had been dropped into someone else's life, someone else's story. I had thought I was the one who knew him best. I had thought that my love for him gave me insight, that it placed me at the center of his truth. But I was not even on the map. I was a footnote. That night I sat alone, staring at the phone in my hand. I knew I should not go. I knew that seeing him would only tangle my thoughts more. But I needed answers. I needed to hear his voice, to see his face. I needed him to look me in the eye and either confess or lie. Either way I would know. The jail visitation room was quiet. The guard led me in without comment. Daniel sat behind the glass, his hands folded neatly on the table. He looked tired but not broken. When he saw me, he smiled. I was hoping you would come, he said softly. I stared at him, not speaking. Look, he began. I know things are confusing right now, but you have to understand people are desperate. They say anything to protect themselves. I did not respond. Waited. That woman, he continued. She is bitter. I ended things years ago. She wanted more than I could give, and when I refused, she turned on me. 4 years, I thought. 4 years and you never mentioned her. She is lying, he said firmly, his eyes locking on mine. All of them are. They are trying to create a story that is not real. They want a villain. I am just easy to paint that way. My voice was quiet when I finally spoke. What about the threats? The recordings? The payments to silence people? He frowned, shook his head. You are starting to sound like them, he said. You know me. You know I would never hurt anyone. I wanted to scream, to shake the glass and demand the truth. Instead I just watched him. His face was so familiar. His voice still calm, still persuasive. But something was different now. The spell had begun to break. His words no longer wrapped around me like comfort. They pressed against me like weight. He leaned forward. They are turning you against me. But I know you. You are better than that. I stood up. He called my name once, but I did not answer. I walked away, the sound of his voice fading behind me. In the days that followed, I began to detach in ways I had not expected. The pain was still there, deep, persistent, but it no longer blinded me. I saw him clearly now. The cracks in his mask were no longer subtle. They were deep and obvious. His lies were not clever anymore. They were desperate. I stopped defending him. When people asked me how I was holding up, I no longer said, I believe in him. I said, I do not know who he is. That truth tasted bitter in my mouth, but it was real. I revisited every memory, every moment we had shared. And with each one I saw new details, signs I had missed, excuses that had never made sense, moments that had felt off, now reframed with new understanding. There was the night he disappeared for hours after saying he would only be gone a few minutes. He had come back with a wild story about helping a friend move something urgent, but he had smelled of cologne that was not mine and had a scratch on his wrist he could not explain. There was the woman who had approached me at a party, her eyes narrow, her words careful. She had asked how I knew Daniel. When I said we were together, she had gone quiet. Later I had asked him who she was. He said she was an old colleague with a grudge. Now I wondered if she had been something else entirely. Each recollection stung like a fresh wound. But it was the act of remembering that set me free. I had spent years believing in an image. Now I was learning to believe in my own instincts again. One evening I looked at an old photo of us, taken on vacation 3 years ago. We were standing on a cliffside, arms wrapped around each other, the ocean behind us. I remembered how happy I had felt that day. But now, looking at it, I saw something new. My smile was wide, genuine. His was calculated. His eyes were not on me. They were on the camera, on the performance. I set the photo down and whispered to the silence around me. I am done. It was not a declaration for anyone else. It was for me. The first step toward reclaiming myself. The trial was not over, but my belief in him was. I would still sit through it, still listen to every word. But now I was no longer there for him. I was there for the truth. And I was ready to hear all of it. The courtroom was almost unbearably silent. It was the kind of silence that did not feel peaceful but heavy, thick, and brimming with unspoken thoughts. I could hear my own breathing. I could feel the sweat gathering at the base of my neck, despite the cool air conditioning humming faintly above. Everyone in the room had their eyes locked on the jury box. 12 people, ordinary citizens, who had spent weeks listening to the most intimate, shameful, and complex details of a life I thought I knew. They would now speak what we had all been waiting for. Daniel sat just ahead of me. He had chosen a navy blue suit that day, one of the few he had left. His posture was calm. His eyes scanned the jurors' faces without panic. I wondered if he already knew the answer. If he had accepted it in some private place where guilt and consequence met in silence. Or if he still believed he could charm his way out of this. He had done it before, had he not? He had charmed me. He had manipulated me. Lied with such ease that it passed for sincerity. I had once thought that meant he was complicated, layered. Now I knew it meant something else entirely. The foreperson stood. A woman in her early 60s, with short gray hair and eyes that carried the burden of judgment. The judge asked for the verdict. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, she said, we find the defendant guilty. A rush of sound swept through the courtroom, a mixture of gasps, murmurs, and someone quietly crying in the back. I did not move. I did not blink. My heart thudded in my chest, heavy and relentless, but I remained frozen. I had prepared myself for this moment. Or at least I had told myself I had. But preparation means nothing when your reality shatters, even if you already saw the cracks forming. More charges were read. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word landed like a stone in my chest, not because I still believed in his innocence, but because I had once tied so much of myself to his fate. I had imagined a future with this man. I had built my world around him. I had absorbed his burdens, defended him against my own instincts, and spoken his name like it was a shield. And now, as the courtroom reacted, I felt that shield melt away. There was no protection anymore, no denial to hide behind. There was only truth. Daniel did not flinch. He did not hang his head or cry. He turned slightly, caught my eye, and gave the faintest shake of his head, as if the jury had failed him, not the other way around. As if the world misunderstood what only he could explain. I felt nothing when he looked at me. Not love, not hate, just a deep, endless fatigue. After the gavel fell, I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost an hour. I watched people leave in waves, their expressions solemn or relieved. Some looked over at me, recognizing me from the press coverage. I no longer felt the need to hide. I had lived under the weight of protecting him for too long. Now I was done hiding. Later that night, I found myself staring at the wall in my living room, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders like armor. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from old friends, from reporters, from relatives I had not spoken to in years. But I ignored them all. I did not want noise. I wanted understanding. My mind drifted to a moment from the past, one that I had buried. A year before his arrest, Daniel had taken a trip that he said was for work. He had kissed my forehead and told me he would miss me, then walked out the door with his suitcase. 3 days later, he had returned with souvenirs, a tan, and a new story to tell. I had believed him. But I remembered now clearly, the receipt I had found tucked into the bottom of the suitcase. A receipt for a dinner for two in a different city than the one he had claimed to visit. I had asked him about it, and he had laughed, pulled me close, told me it was for a meeting that ran late. I had wanted so badly to believe him that I did. But now I saw that moment for what it was. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. Lie. One of many. The truth, when it fully unraveled, was even worse than what the prosecution had presented. In the weeks after the trial, people began to talk. Quietly at first, then more openly. One of his former business partners came forward with additional documents, proof of further embezzlement, manipulation, and coercion. Another woman came forward, one who had been afraid to speak during the trial, and described her years with Daniel. Her story mirrored mine, down to the very phrases he had used to make her feel safe, needed, loved. The pattern was undeniable. Daniel had not stumbled into corruption. He had constructed it carefully, like a house of cards built on charm and half-truths. He had used people, women, friends, clients, as stepping stones. And when one of them became too much trouble, he would erase them from his life with a chilling ease. One afternoon I broke down completely. I was alone in the house, going through some of the things he had left behind, when I found a photo of us from our first anniversary. I looked at it for a long time, then crumpled it in my hands, falling to the floor in sobs that would not stop. My chest felt like it might break open from the force of it. I had loved him, truly, deeply, with every part of my being, and I had been nothing more than a chapter in his carefully crafted performance. But when the tears were finally spent, when the ache settled into something quieter, something steadier, I felt the smallest flicker of strength rise inside me. Not defiance, not vengeance, just the beginning of something new. Began to talk. To my family. To the friends who had once distanced themselves. To the people who had stood by silently, not knowing what to say. I told them what I had seen, what I had experienced. I did not try to protect him anymore. I did not soften my words to make myself look better. I told the truth. And I told it to myself most of all. I had been naive. I had ignored warning signs. I had confused manipulation with love. But I had also been honest in my feelings, loyal in my actions, and brave in my choices, even when those choices led me through fire. The public had its opinion. Some saw me as another one of his victims. Others blamed me for standing by him too long. I stopped caring what the world thought. I had lived too long in the shadow of his story. Now it was time to live my own. I began writing again. I had always loved words, long before I met Daniel. They had always been my refuge, my quiet rebellion. So I wrote. I wrote about truth. About how it does not always come in grand declarations, but in small moments, Like when you finally stop justifying the unjustifiable, or when you look at someone you once loved and realize you no longer know them. I told my story not for sympathy, but for clarity. For anyone who had been where I was. For anyone who had loved a mask and been burned by the face underneath. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to feel like myself again. I would never forget what happened. It was carved into me now, part of my history. But it no longer owned me. Daniel was behind bars. The system had done what it was meant to do. But more importantly, I had freed myself. From illusion, from guilt, from the chains of silence. And in the quiet that followed, I found peace. Not perfect, not painless, but real. The kind that comes when you finally tell the truth. It had been almost 7 months since the trial ended, and life had taken on a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm. There were no more court dates marked on my calendar, no more hushed conversations with lawyers, and no more news vans waiting at the end of the driveway. In their place were the mundane, necessary pieces of healing. Grocery lists, morning walks, unread books finally opened, and deep breaths that did not carry the weight of dread. I had moved into a smaller place by the coast, far from the neighborhood where Daniel and I had lived. It was not extravagant, not particularly stylish, but it was mine. The kind of place where I could hear myself think. The first thing I unpacked was not a photo or a painting. It was my journal. The one I had stopped writing in during the trial. The one that had once been filled with dreams and daily moments, until the weight of what I had been living through had pressed all the words out of me. Now words were returning, slowly but with meaning. I wrote about the ache of betrayal, but also about the quiet beauty of rediscovering myself. I wrote about the kindness of strangers who had offered comfort when they recognized me. I wrote about the women who had reached out privately with their own stories, of being manipulated, deceived, discarded. And I wrote about how, for the first time in years, I no longer woke up bracing for a lie. But even with all that healing, the shadows lingered. Some nights, I would find myself lying awake, replaying moments I had tried to bury. The sound of Daniel's voice in the courtroom, so calm and composed. The look in his eyes when the verdict was read. The questions that still had no answers. It did not matter how much time passed or how far I tried to move. There were pieces of him that had wedged themselves into the cracks of my memory. What haunted me most was not just what he had done, but how I had defended him. How I had stood by him with complete faith, even when my own instincts had started to scream. I had mistaken loyalty for love. I had confused being needed with being valued. And in doing so, I had almost lost myself completely. One late afternoon, I was sorting through a box of documents I had not touched since the trial. I was planning to throw most of it away. Old legal notes, court schedules, and news clippings I had once tried to keep track of. But at the very bottom of the box, there was an envelope that did not have my handwriting on it. Had no return address. Just my name, written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. I hesitated before opening it. My first thought was that it could be from one of the other women. That maybe someone had found the courage to share a piece of the puzzle I had not yet seen. But when I opened it, I felt the blood drain from my face. Inside was a letter from a woman named Celeste, written 3 months ago. She was not one of Daniel's victims. At least, not in the way I expected. She had worked with him nearly 10 years before I met him, at a private investment firm that had quietly folded under the weight of internal scandals. Scandals that never made the public eye because the right people had been paid to keep them quiet. Her letter was clear and cold. She told me about how Daniel had once been under investigation for manipulating financial records to drain trust funds from elderly clients. How the company's senior partners had protected him, not out of loyalty, but because Daniel had information on them too. The entire matter had been buried, files sealed, reputations preserved. But she had kept one copy of a document with Daniel's signature on it, an early blueprint of the kind of fraud he would later scale into something much larger. She had enclosed a copy, and then she wrote something that made my skin crawl. She said Daniel had told her once, during a drunken celebration, that he could make anyone believe anything. That he could cry on cue, twist any truth, and that he had never loved a woman who did not serve a purpose. She had thought he was just being cruel in jest. But when she saw the news about the trial and saw my face in the photographs, she said she felt something inside her break. She wanted me to know the full truth. Not just about what he had done, but about who he had always been. For a long time after reading the letter, I just sat there, the pages trembling in my hand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to disappear into the kind of silence that erases everything. But instead I walked to the window and opened it wide. The ocean air rushed in. Brisk, salty, real. And I realized that this truth, this final, painful, awful truth, was not a curse. It was a gift. A final, brutal confirmation that what I had felt, what I had feared, was valid. It was no longer a question of whether I had been lied to. It was a confirmation that I had been chosen, targeted, for my kindness, for my loyalty, for the very things that made me good. And that knowledge, instead of breaking me, steadied me. I called my attorney the next morning and told her about the letter. I gave her the document, asked her to pass it on to the authorities. I knew it might not change Daniel's sentence, but it mattered that the truth was out there. It mattered that the mask was removed, once and for all. And then I started writing again, not just for myself but for others. I began a blog, quiet at first, anonymous. I wrote about emotional manipulation, about the long road to reclaiming one's voice. I wrote about how love can be a beautiful thing, but when twisted, it can become a weapon in the wrong hands. Within weeks, messages started coming in. Women mostly. Men. All with stories. All with wounds. All trying to make sense of the pain someone else had caused. And through their voices, I began to hear my own more clearly. I found a kind of strength I never thought I would. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that kicks down doors or yells into microphones. But the quiet, steady kind that wakes up every day and chooses to live with intention. The kind that learns to forgive oneself. The kind that stops apologizing for believing in the wrong person, and instead honors the lessons learned. I still think about Daniel sometimes. It is impossible not to. But I no longer think of him with longing or rage. I think of him the way I think of a storm that once destroyed everything I owned. He was a force, lesson, a devastation. And then, eventually, he was just part of the past. The future, however, belongs to me. And in that future I speak the truth. I hold my head high. I trust my instincts. And I never again confuse silence for strength or loyalty for love. I reclaimed my life. And I will never give it away again.